They say life is what you make it. So what happens if you actually try? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually grind out when the time's right? What if you actually blinded by your hindsight? What if you actually find out what defines life? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? I'm getting 1% better every day. I'm getting 1% better every way. I'm waking up every day to a sunny day. No matter what the weather say, life is like a record, so just let it play.
Alrighty, welcome back, guys. If you actually tried to live the high life, this is another Friday community hangout here on BestDayEverMedia, and today we're going to be talking about like a little bit of a book club. I've been reading a lot in my life. Like I read voraciously as a kid to the point where I would get in trouble quite often from my mom for kind of reading, staying up late, skipping out on sleep so that I could have a little flashlight or something under the blanket so that she couldn't see under the door. And I would just crank books. Like, honestly, that was like my favorite thing to do as a kid. Like, we didn't have much, but we always had a library. So, the library membership that came very early. And that was honestly a little bit to do with my aunt. She initially got me a library card for the Collingwood Public Library. And that was like one of the things we would do. Like when she had some free time, like one of our little outings was to go down to the library and like pick out books. And the library would let you take out like, I think 4 books at a time. And I would just max out on books every single time. And you actually had a decent amount of time with the books. Like I think you had like 3 or 4 weeks with them. So I could crank basically a book a week. And I did that for a long time. So reading's always been a huge part of my life, and it definitely set me up for success in both school and post-secondary, and then in business later. So I would love to have that conversation with you today, Matt. What's your experience been like with books? Like, do you remember the first book you ever read, or like one of the first books where you felt truly passionate about it, like you were reading for fun?
Yeah, and like I guess we'll define a book here, like for the sake of this, as like something with tens of thousands of words, right?
Oh my god! Yeah, I mean, like, yeah, okay, yeah.
Well,
outside of short stories.
Well, like I mean, like the first book you read maybe was like Clifford the Red Dog, right, or something like that.
Yeah.
Like it's not going to be like a real novel. I think probably the first book that stands out for me was Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth. So
Interesting.
I think that would have been like, again, like there was maybe a couple other books like Rin Tin Tin and not like Old Yeller, but something adjacent to that that were like books that I just found. But yeah, the first like I think like legit book I read that was definitely like written for adults or young adults would have been like, I think I don't know, like grade 3-ish, and it was like Jules Verne. Like fell in love with it, and then read like a bunch of old like science fiction classics off that. So I forget what other books of Jules Verne I would have read, but like 20,000 Leagues Beneath the Sea and a few others like that. Maybe like a little bit of H.G. Wells. And yeah, absolutely loved those books. And like for me, books always like sometimes it's a slow burn before I get into a book and like really sink my teeth into it. But when I do, like it becomes all encompassing. And for myself, very similar to like there's different seasons in life or different like periods, like kind of periods of time in your life. And for me, books often like mark that period as well. So, I can think of when new ideas or new concepts or just new experiences were introduced. And oftentimes, like I'd be reading a certain series of books at that time as well. And one thing that's just kind of funny when you talk about like hiding under the covers, reading books and stuff like that. I never had that exact experience, but at the same time that like books can be so all encompassing. like I've literally like back in the day when I worked in public accounting, like there was a day I can remember I called in sick just because I wanted to finish this book. I was like, this is too good. Like I'm not going to get any work done anyways because I'm just going to be thinking about the book. So I can remember it might have even been like literally the first time I called in sick. It probably was that I called in sick to that job. And yeah, it's just kind of funny to look back and think about that.
That's awesome. Do you remember the book that caused that reaction? That's a pretty visceral reaction to the book where you're just like, you know what? This is a trade-off that I'm not willing to make. I'm reading this thing today.
I do remember the book. I'll share it with you offline, but um yeah, but I don't like there's so many different like again, when I think about like certain books and reading them, like to me it's like a chapter in my life. So I can remember
Yeah.
when I first got my day job or like my first like real day job out of university working as an accountant and I read Asimov's Foundation series, right? Or I can remember being in like grade 7 and reading Lord of the Rings and then consuming everything that Tolkien essentially had ever written and even some of the stuff that like his son finished, like I think Christopher Tolkien and stuff like that. Um, so yeah, definitely. I'm a huge fanboy of like book series as well, right? So like Harry Turtledove in University and reading alternative fiction, Neil Gaiman. Like usually when I find a good author, like I immediately want to devour everything that they've written.
Yeah, I definitely had that strategy as well. Like I remember very early on, probably around the same time, yeah, like grade 7, like I crushed all the Tolkien stuff. Around the same time, maybe grade 8, I picked up Stephen King and just went on like a Stephen King massacre. Like I read every Stephen King book I think that was available to me at the time, and we had this little bookstore called, I think it was called Cover to Cover or something like that in Wood, and it was like this dusty old son of a bitch. Like it was so old and decrepit, and the lady fit the bill that was in there. But you could tell this lady any author at all and she'd be like, oh yeah, I have that somewhere, and she would like go digging through the bookcases, and like she straight up would like be flying through bins and like dig to the bottom of like the 17th bin on the third row, and like she just knew where everything was. And about that time as well, I picked up Tom Clancy, and man, did I read like every Tom Clancy, like all the Rainbow Six stuff, and I just went absolutely nuts on Tom Clancy, and I think that got me into spy stuff and like the government conspiracy stuff really early, because Tom Clancy would write these really epic thriller books about like, you know, there would be like this protagonist, and then he's out working for the government, and then all of a sudden the government would kind of like burn him down, and then he would have to like fight and save his life or whatever, but ultimately he was fighting for the greater good to like protect America. And that was sort of like the Rainbow Six series in a nutshell. Or there would be like these large like Cold War style books about you know, Russia versus US, right, and some of the backdoor stuff there, and that really got me interested in like, oh wow, like the world's a bigger place, right? Because at the time I had only been reading just like straight like science fiction, right, with like Tolkien and stuff like that. Do you consider Tolkien science fiction? Is that really what that is? I don't
Science
know, but
fiction, fantasy, yeah.
fantasy, yeah, I think, yeah, fantasy is probably a better tag for that. But you know, reading Tolkien like opened my mind to like, oh cool, like there's these huge adventures that are possible. But then the Tom Clancy stuff kind of grounded it better into something that could be real. And I think that's inspired some of the other reading that I do today that I find really exciting. But getting there was interesting. Like when I was in uh, primary or elementary school, I was part of the Silver Birch Club. Like, did you ever do any of those reading competitions?
No, no, I'm
No.
not sure if they were around or maybe my schools just didn't do them.
Yeah, like I'm from a slightly bigger town than you, but so anyways, we had Silver Birch, and like the thing there was like it just seemed like this daunting task. You had to read some number of books in a set period of time, and then essentially like have a bunch of summaries and stuff on that. And what that taught me was to like basically read to understand, right? And I think that was a big step for a young kid to make, was like, okay, just kind of reading and like kind of letting the words go through your mind, but then to be able to read it and then regurgitate it in your own words in the form of a summary was like the next step of reading for me. And that's where I started to really understand that like, oh shit, like books are actually a way to essentially learn how to write. So like you could learn these new words at the time too. Like, computers weren't where they're at today. So like I would read, I always had a dictionary in my headboard. So I had a dictionary in my headboard, and I would I'd be reading new books, and I would just flip through the dictionary like, oh shit, I don't understand this word. Go to the dictionary. Now I know the word. Now it's in my vocabulary and I can start using it. And like, I feel like those two things and that understanding was honestly like a moonshot for me in like my academic phase of life, where I was just like, oh, okay, like you read to learn, to understand, to then be able to apply it to your own life. And I feel like that was a massive step up. And that kind of inspired some of the reading I did later, where I kind of transitioned out of, authors like Anne Rice, who's writing like, everybody would know The Interview with a Vampire, right? And it was just because like my mom had these books around, and my stepdad had Tolkien around, and Stephen King. So I was reading like Anne Rice and Tolkien and Stephen King as like fantasy and science fiction. But that then turned into like, oh shit, like you can read to understand and learn things. So then I would pick up like a carpentry book from Black and Decker and like read that, and now all of a sudden you kind of know how a house works, and you're like, oh man, this is really cool. And so I felt myself kind of dabbling in those different fronts of like, just like real world learning through some of these books, even the fantasy ones. And I see a comment here from Chicken Little too, saying like, I read nonfiction, something that I can learn from. But I feel like I've honestly, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this, Matt, but I honestly feel like I've learned just as much from my academic books, like my textbooks in school, and like reading for understanding, like on the construction side of things. But I feel like I've learned just as much from some of the fiction that I've read. And I don't want to pull us too far into like television with this, but like, Star Trek for me was not about uh the CGI at the time. It wasn't really about the uniforms and the shit they were wearing. It was about the lessons learned and takeaways from their adventures while they were doing those episodes, right? They had a specific philosophic takeaway. And I've always felt that science fiction or fantasy and that type of thing was always about that for me. Like that's where I learned a lot about like the human condition, right? And like just some of the challenges we have as a society and in our different philosophies. Were you experiencing that? Like, were you aware of that while you were reading these things?
Uh, I I wouldn't say so until probably university, and then around that time. But I guess from my perspective, like it's different types of education or knowledge that comes out of like a nonfiction book versus a fiction book. So I would say there's very little practical I learned from the fiction series that like I would have read and consumed, but I think that science fiction is the perfect playground for exploring large ideas. And so I think a lot of like political philosophy, a lot of like big ideas, social constructs, social contracts, things of that nature, definitely learned a lot through the science fiction I consumed, particularly with like writers like Asimov or Heinlein. Um, and because like again Heinlein's writings are just littered with libertarian and anarchist themes, right, and exploring different governmental constructs and things of that nature. And I think in one of his books, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, maybe essentially like it feels like a perfect analogy for today's um modern politics, where essentially like the world essentially coalesces under a one world government, but like there's a king that, or an emperor, I think it's actually called, that like gets elected, but he's literally just a figurehead to like almost like blow off the steam, so that like a populist like Trump or socialist oriented politicians that are just going to promise you the world of other people's money, they can like essentially get that out of their system without actually like mucking up the day-to-day operations of a large political entity. And so yeah, definitely like it exposed me to big ideas and concepts, and like more practically speaking, like Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, right? That obviously is very a political exploration, but there wasn't like, I didn't learn like life lessons or like things like, be in control of yourself, or like try and focus on what you like. to me, the lessons I learned is it's very distinctive between like fiction, fantasy, science fiction, and nonfiction, like self-help, personal development, things of that nature.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, certainly like some of the professional development self-help things feel a lot more tactical, right? Like they'll give you something to start doing today or stop doing today, which is often really cool. But I definitely found myself very, at a young age, I was extremely fascinated as well with Shakespeare. And like I read all the Shakespeare plays, countless times. And I actually, sorry, St. Mary's and Vanier, but I actually stole like the whole fucking collection from the school at a pretty early age too. And I just brought them home and like would take my notes down in the books, and like they were like old copies of these things. So like there would be other notes from other people in there, and like that was a fun thing for me as well, like just finding little Easter eggs in these books. Like somebody might be writing in the book with like, you know, a criticism or something like that, but it would just make you look at the book a little bit differently and just kind of understand that like somebody else has read this. And I think that was really cool. um Another book that I liberated from the school, or another author's works that I liberated from the school, was Orwell stuff and Huxley. So I really gravitated to Animal Farm first. I thought that was a really interesting exploration, and I had never seen an allegory before. So like for me, when I first was going through it, I didn't really get it. But one of my co-ops that I did at my high school was I worked with the English teacher to grade papers and stuff, because I was very fascinated by writing early on. And so when we were going through Animal Farm, he kind of gave me the history lesson at the same time reading this allegory, and I was like, dude, that is so cool. Like that sounded like such an interesting way to convey a different set of ideas and sort of skirt the possible punishment, or possible ramifications of actually speaking out against that type of a government. And like that just blew my mind. I was like, okay, so oh my God. And like other people would understand the history and like really connect these dots. And he's like, yeah, like this was just well understood. And I'm like, holy shit, this is brilliant. Kind of my first opportunity to learn that like the approach wasn't always the best way, right? Like there are often better ways where you could skirt that initial conflict. And like later reading Sun Tzu and stuff like that, you're like, yeah, you probably almost never want a direct approach, because it's probably going to result in a failure. So that I found was really exciting. And just kind of cranking through some of those books really opened my eyes to I get politics, but also just like the beauty and artwork behind creative writing and even allegories themselves. That was definitely a fun exploration for me. So do you have a favorite series, Matt, that you would pick up, or that you've read like multiple times where you just kind of go back to it?
It's pretty rare for me to read a fiction book more than once. So I think I could probably count on one hand the number of fiction books I've read more than once. And I think that would be 1984 by Orwell. And I never would have read it a second time, except for we did it as a book club with our team. Um, uh, the the man the Mandalays or the Mandar. It's right over there. But anyways, a fantastic book about the collapse of society. I've read that book twice, and I'll probably read that one a third time. And Heinlein's A Stranger in a Strange Land. I think those are honestly the only fiction books I would have ever read more than once.
Yeah, you at one
How about
point
you?
actually mentioned to me that that was one of your favorites, and I got the audiobook, but it's not digestible by audio. So one of these days I'll read that book on
Hmm.
paper. And to be completely honest, I haven't read a paperback in a very long time. I think it might be a healthy thing to take up, and the Citadel might be a great place to experiment with that, just because like the Wi-Fi doesn't reach too far outside of the cabin. But I've been doing a lot of multitasking lately with like an audiobook in the ear while you're driving or while you're walking or while you're doing, you know, chores around the house. And that's been a great way to crush a lot of books. But certainly the voracious reading from paperback has stopped for me. But for me, there's a couple series actually that I've read multiple times. The one is like honestly not even great writing, but like the fantasy part of it was so captivating that it just had to be read multiple times by me. And that was it's called The Inheritance Cycle, and the first book of that is called Aragon, and some of you guys might remember the really shitty Hollywood production of it, and they kind of honestly ruined it. But um Aragon was this fantastic exploration of like very I guess like similar to Game of Thrones, with like dragons and magic and shit like that, but with like some sort of cross between like Tolkien and George R.R. Martin, but reading at like a much lower level. But the fantasy element of it was so exciting, and the strength and fortitude and challenges faced by the characters in the book were just so captivating to me that I had to read it multiple times. So I really enjoyed reading through that one. And lately, I'm actually doing a reread of the entire series by Jack Carr. And I don't think the series really has a name, but the first book in the series is called The Terminal List, which was made popular recently by the Amazon series made about it. And I find that to be a really exciting exploration of sort of a former Navy SEAL's take on power dynamics, corruption, government collusion, things like that in society and where we're at. And that's been a very exciting read because I'm also interested in some of the other, like, the firearms side of things, and hunting and shooting. And so like I'm interested in that stuff, but it's also, I can see definitely an expression of experience from this Navy SEAL's perspective and some of the things that he sees wrong with the current governments and what's going on in the world. So that's been a fun one to reread. Do you have a particular nonfiction book that you feel stands out to you?
I guess I put them all in a category of their own, and it's difficult with nonfiction, like what to differentiate, because oftentimes there'll be overlap between the different concepts, right? So I think sometimes it really comes down to even just your timing. Like, if you've read Rich Dad Poor Dad, The Wealthy Barber hits less, right? But if
Yeah.
you've read Wealthy Barber first, it probably hits hard. So I think for me, honestly, just it's it's very rare that I read a book, fiction or nonfiction, and regret it. In fact, like I think only as a child was there a handful of books I uh abandoned, and like they were literally like, when you'd go to chapters and there'd be the discount bin or whatever, and it'd be like taking a gamble based upon the cover. So yeah, like I think my default answer, I guess, would be like Rich Dad Poor Dad, because it was probably one of the first um personal development oriented books that I'd consumed. How about you?
Yeah, there's a few that really stand out to me. Rich Dad Poor Dad was obviously a huge catalyst in deciding to kind of put more on the line and take the risk. And so Rich Dad will always have a large place in my heart. But prior to reading Rich Dad, one of the first books I read that was professional development oriented was actually Trump's book, The Art of the Deal. And just a library find. It sounded cool. At the time, he would have been on what the hell was that celebrity show called?
The Apprentice.
Yeah, he would have been like that would have been on TV at the time. So like he was a big deal at that moment. Before he was, because he kind of disappeared really from public eye for a long time after that. But at that time he was huge. So I was like, oh well, this guy sounds like he's doing real things, and he's firing people on TV. It's kind of hilarious, but let's see what he's got to say. The Art of the Deal was actually a fantastic book at the time for me. I certainly was not exposed to concepts like that prior to that. And there was no like real estate or anything like that in my family. But yeah, I read through The Art of the Deal, and then Rich Dad Poor Dad I thought it was really great. And following that, like some books like Extreme Ownership from Jocko Willink, that really stood out as a great book to me, or The 10X Rule by Grant Cardone. I found that to be an interesting exploration, or even Be Obsessed or Be Average, like I just wasn't really familiar with those concepts that you could just straight up go all in on something and force it to work and make it to become the best if you just literally set your mind to that type of thing. But he also says it without just like the rah of like, yeah, if you think you can do it. Like I also read Think and Grow Rich, Napoleon Hill, and I thought it was okay, but didn't love it. Compared to Be Obsessed or Be Average, where you're just like, listen, you're going to have haters, you're going to have naysayers, people are going to criticize you, you're going to lose your social circle. But if you actually want this thing, here's what you have to do. And I thought that was a great and clear and very simple to digest message that I found to be very impactful. But yeah, I mean, there's countless of those books. Have you ever read a biography that you enjoyed? Because I found that was one of the categories of books where I was like, I literally couldn't care less about this. And then I read the Tiger Woods book. I think it's just called Tiger, or maybe it's called Tiger Woods. And I was legitimately blown away at the quality of that book. It was fantastic. The story inside of it was brilliant. Again, just like so many takeaways and like lessons learned that you could just grab from this guy's experience. Regardless of what you think about him socially, like it was a very interesting exploration. And I never thought that I would be captivated by that category of books. So I found that surprising. Have you ever read one like that?
I've definitely read a couple autobiographies and a handful of biographies, but I don't nothing's immediately jumping out at me. I'm sure there's maybe I guess like yeah, sort of. The books that stand out to me the most were I don't think people would think of as traditional biographies because they would just focus on a person's life for a short period of time. So there's Stuka Pilot about the most decorated um, pilot in the history. I think still the history of the world. He had the most whatever like kills or things, and he fought for Germany. And then there's the Eastern Front, and so they're both books about German soldiers during World War II, guys with very checkered past. So like caveat there. These books may eventually just find themselves on banned book list someday, but yeah, like they were interesting, but like I wasn't really interested too much in their lives before or after, and it's not even discussed. It's about like essentially the lead up to their joining the Third Reich, and then their experiences, and then a tiny bit of their escape afterwards, because both these guys tried to escape punishment for what they did. And I believe both of those were actually autobiographies now that I think of it. And usually I find those to be less interesting, but I think it was just because the subject matter they were dealing with were so strong. But I think that for me, most biographies are probably better served in like a 3 hour interview. Like I'd much rather hear your life story on a Joe Rogan or Lex Friedman podcast than to read a book, even if the book's going to be a more thorough and detailed and thoughtful exploration of it. I think that the interview process for me is a more humanizing experience, and that's like key for me to really take something away from your biography.
Yeah, that's definitely a fun perspective. Yeah, a couple other books, like this is very much not a biography, but it seemed to sort of categorize the experiences of one individual and kind of lessons learned there. And that was Steve Sims' Blue Fishing that we read with the
Hmm.
team. And like that was a really fun exploration of like this guy just kind of taking control of his life and using some really fantastic strategies to stand out and make himself make a name for himself really and become successful by using some sort of non-traditional tactics and strategies to become a great successful marketer. And like at the time he was like promoting events at like this private club or something, and just the strategies and level of ingenuity that he deployed was really quite fantastic. And he also introduced us to the concept of, or the term, the chug test, which I've been using in my company for a long time. Like if you wouldn't chug a beer with somebody, they're probably not worth working with. And I think that's great. Very simple rule of thumb. But, you don't find that in Rich Dad Poor Dad, right? That's a totally different type of book. And I
Yeah,
thought that it was great to hear from him.
I guess adjacent to that is like, if talking about biographies, like books about people building businesses. So like the Zappos story and a few of those other books. Again, usually they're through the lens of trying to teach you the lessons they learned by growing like large successful businesses or sometimes failing at business. And I don't view it through that lens because it's not necessarily like about their life stories or their inner turmoils. But that's probably also like Bluefish and kind of like biography adjacent books.
Yeah, awesome. Um, yeah, one fun book too that I read this year, and like I really don't know if there's any takeaways for it, but I'm just personally really fascinated by it. Was the Ready Player One book? I thought it was just such an interesting exploration of this kind of like childlike enthusiasm in a mission, and this kind of band of misfits getting together and just like going all out on one mission, and their level of devotion to that project. And then obviously it had the exploration of like, what would society look like if we actually fully went to virtual reality, where like most of your in-person real world experiences were diminished, and we drive our focus. It was kind of like, what's the logical conclusion of all this technological advancement, right? And it turns out like the world they portrayed was like this very destitute, poor, poverty's running rampant, population densities is really crazy, so you're just living on top of people, so it's not really enjoyable to be out in the world anyways. So you just logically lean on all that tech that's come up, and haptic suits and VR, and like these are all things in tech that we have today, right? Like it's maybe not it's obviously not at the level that they're describing in that book, but it doesn't seem like we're all that far away from there. And it was just a really cool societal exploration while keeping it super lighthearted and fun. And then obviously some nostalgic stuff in there too, with the various consoles and games and different things that he was bringing up. And I thought that was a fantastic book. And I know I talked your ear off about it when we were doing our other show. I just couldn't shut up about it. And I think that's like the hallmark of a great book. Like if you just have to talk about it while you're reading it, that to me is like the stand up type of thing. Do you have any fun books like that are kind of, off topic but fun?
Yeah, like the audio version of Ready Player One was a really good listen with Will Wheaton. Yeah, I threw in the chat there for anyone that's interested. The book I was thinking of earlier, uh, a fiction book that I've read more than once, is The Mandibles, A Family 2029 to 2047, um, which essentially just views the societal collapse of the United States and the impact and response and like survival of a family or members of a family throughout that time period. There's just something really unique about the way it's framed and presented. And again, I've read it twice. I'll probably read it a third time. Right now, I'm actively reading. What it's maybe not the exact same name, but like the House of the Dragon or whatever. The book the TV show is based upon. I enjoyed reading the Game of Thrones series and all that. Uh, and again, there's very few books I read that I don't like. There's almost always something to take away from them.
Yeah, except Mark Manson's goddamn book. What was that called? The Subtle Art of Not Giving a
Not
Fuck.
giving a fuck. Again,
That was literally the shittiest book I've ever read.
it wasn't like terrible. It's just like because it was kind of supposed to be in the personal development realm. There's so much greatness in a lot of those books that I think, as an avid consumer of them, you know, it wasn't life changing for me. However, I could honestly believe it to be a gateway drug for people that had never consumed anything in that genre. And like again, that thing about like timing with books, so much of it's timing, like when you choose to consume it. Like one of the first personal development books I read after Rich Dad Poor Dad and the Wealthy Barber was the Napoleon Hill one, right? How to Win Friends and Influence People. And that was fantastic. But again, I do think that
That's
there's
Peter
probably
Drucker, by the way.
oh, okay. Well,
Me
whatever Napoleon Hill's one was, there was
Think
something
and Grow Rich.
Think and Grow Rich. And or also, but also the all those books. Like I consumed like 30 of those personal development books in like a year. Um, but like all those books are very solid, but it the reason they were so good for me at the time was because I hadn't consumed much of those books. Um, so again, I think like the timing of those books is key. I was trying to think. Oh, there's been a series of books that I've been enjoying from like James Wesley. They're essentially about the collapse of the United States. Like it's literally like your tinfoil hat, the go-to conspiracy theorist sort of series of novels. I can't think of what they're called now, but essentially it's about, you know, the US government collapses, the UN comes in, and it's like, you know, American patriots versus the blue helmets, right? And
I
like,
think that's what it's called. I just kind of Googled that author name, and I think it's called the Patriots novel series, if that makes
yeah,
sense.
that's
Yeah.
probably it. And so like they're fun. And like if you want to be like a hardcore prepper, it takes it through the lens of like, you know, this is how we set up our fields of fire for the ambush, and like this is where we had our dugouts and um mini trenches and stuff like this. This is the sort of guns we use. This is how I set up my electrical system. So it
Interesting.
almost reads like a textbook, but there's still just a layer of fiction on there. And I think that was a unique way to present the idea of prepping rather than just like I find like reading the manual versions of that stuff very dry. And so
Yeah.
just peppering in even just the slightest amount of fictional and character narrative on top of that definitely made like it was the spoonful of sugar to help the medicine go down.
Yeah, that for me is that Terminal List series. Like it's really not like, yeah, that's exactly what that is, right? He's trying to walk you through like the best equipment, the best tactics, the best shit without actually having it be in a manual format. This guy too, I can see James Wesley Rawls is a former U.S. Army intelligence officer and a survival retreat consultant, and describes himself as a libertarian. So that's pretty cool.
Well, he ran the Survivalist blog, which is like the number one prepper website, I think.
Yep.
So yeah, essentially, I think what he did was repurposed a lot of like articles he wrote, layered on. And again, the fiction's not fantastic, but it's just enough to
Yeah.
make it a lot easier to consume, in my opinion. Harry Turtledove's alternative history series, I really enjoyed those when I read those, just because they just felt so outside of normal. And like, I remember like literally every book I can remember like the place and time in my life when I would have consumed it, right? So like I also remember Slaughterhouse-Five. That was like a really trippy thing going like reading that book at that moment in time. And yeah.
I've never heard of that one.
Slaughterhouse-Five, really?
Yeah, I
It's usually brought up in
don't
like
think so.
the 1984 Brave New World, and then
Oh,
like once you kind of get through those usual suspects, that'll be like one of the first ones brought up after it.
oh wow.
Um,
Yeah, I've never heard of that one. So
yeah,
like along the same line though, obviously.
sorta. But like if those were like kind of on an acid trip, maybe
Oh
if
shit.
that helps. So, and that might not
Okay.
be an exact reenactment of it, but that's how I remember it. And
Might
Atlas
as well.
Shrugged had a huge impact on me, and just came at the perfect time in my life as well. I was reading a lot of libertarian oriented blogs and consuming a lot of content, and yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, books. Jesus, I wonder how many books we've read. I honestly wouldn't be able to peg it, but like hundreds of books at this time. And I think I generally speaking agree with you that like, you know, I've never really read a book I didn't like. I really didn't like that Mark Manson book. And there's only one other book that stands out at all to me, and it was the Wuthering Heights. I thought that book was
I
so
hated that. Yeah,
fucking
we were forced to
useless.
watch or read it in high
It
school,
was
and yeah,
it was miserable. Like there was
I
nothing.
wonder if I wouldn't enjoy it now, to be honest. But like at the time, it was just wrong time in the life, right?
Well, like, seriously, they were pushing this on, like, grade 9s or something. Like, what are we talking about here? This is so
Yeah, I
stupid.
think we were maybe grade 10 or 11, but yeah, same.
Yeah, like, it just made no sense,
And
but I do
honestly, I
agree.
didn't enjoy like Macbeth either. I think usually when like forced to read a book, it's because like you're forced to learn it in a certain way and experience it in a certain way. It really diminishes the potential value of it, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. It's funny though, because that's sort of counter how we think of like some of the book clubs that we've run with the company, right? Where like you run a book club, you kind of forcing the team to read it, but it feels like a different spirit, right? It's like, hey, let's read this thing together because I know it's going to lift up all of us, and then we're all speaking the same language and using the same takeaways so that we can improve our financial position, improve our professional skill sets and things like that. And like that never seemed forced. Like for some reason
Well,
that was different.
I view it as highly curated and well framed for the like end consumer. Where again, like with like Worthing Heights, it was like we're gonna read this book, and it's about I barely remember it now, but like about is it a love triangle or whatever, and
Yeah, it's fucking dumb.
whatever period of time in England that took place, but again, like there's probably fascinating insights into the social dynamics there, but like we didn't explore those, right? Like it was
Yeah.
like you remember how the relationship between this and you're just like where I think with the book club there's a exploration there, and also you're getting exposed to other people's perspectives, which I think triggers a different type of like uh learning for you, because like you might walk away having taken a different lesson, and that's fine that you took that different lesson, whereas in school that might have cost you your grade to take away the wrong lesson from that book.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Awesome, guys. Well, yeah, I just wanted to kind of come on here and talk about our experiences with books. And I hope that if you're listening to this, you're also an avid reader. And if you're not, maybe give it a chance. Like I said, there's very few books. And like if I can only conjure up 2 books that I didn't like out of certainly hundreds of books that I've read, it's a good sign, right? There's lots of great authors out there. And often, you can interpret the book however best suits your needs at that moment as well. And I read a lot of professional development books multiple times for that reason. Sometimes you take away something different when you're at a different stage in your business or life. And so you can take away multiple lessons from the same book across different reads. But I'm going to post a short reading list that I have already curated for you guys into our Substack today. And if you haven't read any of those books, I do highly recommend getting through those. And I think that they'll help you out. Most of the books on my list are professional development. So maybe just before I publish it, I'll add a couple of the fiction books that I enjoyed reading and maybe grab some of Matt's recommendations as well. And we'll get you guys a reading list, and we can hopefully when we get together in person, you'll be able to tell me which book was your favorite. You'll be able to, kind of share some of the stories that we can have together as common knowledge. Until then, leave us a comment. We've got Substack, we got Telegram. You can leave a comment on YouTube. You can leave a comment for us on Rumble. We're starving for Rumble comments, so please get in there. Let us know Rumble's actually working for us, and hopefully we'll talk to you guys soon. Hope you guys have the best day ever. Today we're recording this on a Friday, so have an excellent weekend, you guys.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers.
They say life is what you make it. So what happens if you actually try? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually grind out when the time's right? What if you actually blinded by your hindsight? What if you actually find out what defines life? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? I'm getting 1% better every day. I'm getting 1% better every way. I'm waking up every day to a sunny day. No matter what the weather say, life is like a record, so just let it play.